Can you hear me, David? Can you hear me?
Yes, I can. Can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you, David. I can hear you, David. Well, welcome to the Nurses and Hypochondriacs podcast, David Owen.
Thank you. Thank you.
Awesome. So I was telling you a little bit about, and I sent you that email of how I serendipitously or synchronistically found your book. And I've had Dr. Bernard Beitman on my show, who wrote a book on synchronicity. I had him in like 2019 or so. Um, and basically, I was having problems with people listening to me lately. I was, one person in particular, I have a project that I'm launching, and it's actually a magazine. I live in Palm Springs, California, and I'm launching a new magazine. So I was bringing her on as an associate editor. And I had several meetings with her. And one of the meetings, she had this baby, and I thought it was so interesting how she was holding the baby, almost like the baby was a rag doll of sorts. And I was really watching her, and I've never seen a mom hold a baby like that. And I've seen mothers hold thousands of babies in my career of 30 years as a pediatric nurse practitioner. And I just was like, something's just off. Why is she holding the baby that way? And so we were having a series of meetings over the year regarding this project. And in one meeting, she told me that, oh, I'm sorry I haven't contacted you. I've had this really terrible ear infection. You must think it's weird that an older adult has an ear infection. She's like, but when I was like 19 in college, I had 20 ear infections and kept getting the same antibiotic. Like she was on amoxicillin. I had already found your book at the Dollar Tree in Palm Springs, which has amazing book selection that I'm always rummaging through and bringing them. I have like a free library in my clinic. And so I'm always trying to look for books for the kids. And I had the book on my coffee table because I was like, oh, this looks like a really interesting book. I'm sure it could help me. And I flipped it to the perfect page where you started to talk about antibiotics and its effects on hearing, like how streptomycin really messes up your hearing. And I was like, oh my God, that's it. That's it. Like you answered my question synchronistically. I mean, it was crazy. I was like, that's it. She has some type of inner ear issue, which I think it's like affecting her eighth cranial nerve or whatever, or something's going on, which affects her balance, which is why she was awkward, holding her baby. She's very loud. She's very kind of out of sorts. So it's so interesting. But that's how I found you. So tell us a little bit about yourself and how you wrote this awesome book, Volume Control, Hearing in a Deafening World. And I'll hold it up here. It's like trying to see it right here. But yeah,
Um, I've been a magazine and book writer for a long time. I'm a staff writer at the New Yorker and have been since 1991. And I've written books about a lot of different things. I know a little bit about a lot of different things. And
I love it.
the hearing book it began as an article at the New Yorker. It was suggested by an editor, and I had some family interest. My grandmother was very hard of hearing. She lost hearing, especially on one side when she was a teenager, and a young man took her out on a date. They went duck hunting in a boat, and he aimed his shotgun by resting it on her shoulder and fired, and that was it. I mean, it's catastrophic, incredibly loud, and that close to her ear. It's bad if you're just holding it, but to have if you're just a hunter, but if you're basically acting holding up the gun, then it's even worse. And so she struggled through her whole life with terrible hearing problems, which got worse. And I have tinnitus, uh, ringing in the ears, which started. I'm not sure there was a connection, but I'd spent a week in China, and I got the worst cold I've ever had. And when the cold finally went away, like a month later, I noticed that there was this ring in my ears, which didn't go away. And I went to my doctor, and he said, uh, uh, tinnitus is almost always, or maybe even always, accompanied by some hearing loss, at least. And so anyway, he gave me a little simple test. He hit a tuning fork and held it up and told me to tell him when I couldn't hear it anymore. And after he'd held it for a while, he leaned forward because he couldn't hear it anymore. We were both about the same age. We're both about, I'm 69. He's about the same age. So I had some interest, and it's really interesting because hearing is incredibly interesting, and it's sound is interesting, and so I followed all those things. And I would say, just say the woman you knew, I would say that amoxicillin is unlikely to be the cause of her hearing problems, but she was probably what she was being treated for when she was 19, some kind of repeated ear infections, was more likely to be the cause of the problem later. It's probably, could be damage, that just continuing damage.
Sure, for sure, for
Uh,
sure. Like, but what hit me, it was, I know it was probably not the amoxicillin. What hit me was like, wait a minute, there's some type of damage going on
right.
because she should have had tubes put in her ears. And that's what I
Oh,
told
shit.
her.
There's
I
a
was
lot of
like,
things.
yeah, there's so many things. And I told her now, I was like, I would go and really go get treatment or see like a naturopath or something. You need to go see an ear specialist. And she tells me, oh no, like she totally blew it off.
Yeah.
Which is what you talk about in your book, which is so interesting.
Now, people don't take they tend not to take hearing problems as seriously as they take vision problems. The real problems from it was from early antibiotics like streptomycin, which was the first treatment that there was effective treatment that there was for tuberculosis, and it had to be administered over a long period of time. And it is one of a number of drugs and substances that are what are ototoxic, that damage the
Right.
hearing apparatus inside the brain. And there are many others, even something as simple as aspirin, and then
Yes.
many industrial chemicals, uh, you know, bad drugs that OxyContin. But there's the hearing system is incredibly sensitive and tiny and well protected inside the head, but it's susceptible to damage from all kinds of different things. And the main damage that most of us inflict on it, it comes from sound. It's exposure to loud sound. We are maybe people are less careless now than they were when I was growing up. When I was growing up, we went to rock concerts. I mowed lawns without any kind of hearing protection. When we went to concerts, we always tried to sit as close as we possibly could to the speakers so that they would be really, really loud. At home, I listened to music. I tilted two speakers over my head and listened to it that way, and just turned it up as loud as I could stand it. So it's amazing. It's amazing that any of us can hear anything at all. And I spent a number of years working on my house, and I never wore hearing protection when I was using power tools. And one thing you notice is that if you hire a carpenter who's now uh, in his 50s or older, he almost always has some hearing loss. Uh, People are negligent. They're actually more careful now. Now, as you sort of walk around your neighborhood and you see people working in somebody's yard, they're much more likely than they were even 10 years ago to be wearing some kind of hearing protection. You still see people using chainsaws and leaf blowers and lawnmowers without any protection at all, but you're much, 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 much more likely to see uh, even people who don't necessarily look as though they take very good care of themselves, taking more care of their ears. So there's knowledge that's gotten around. More people are more aware of the potential problems than they used to be.
It's so interesting. Going back to the story of your grandmother, it reminds me of that song, that the famous song that Nancy Sinatra sang, Bang Bang.
You
She
know,
shot me down, right? I just went to a fashion show this weekend here at the Palm Springs Art Museum, and they kept playing that song like three times. The first time it was the Frank Sinatra version, which I had never heard before, and they did this ballet to it, and then they played the actual Nancy Sinatra version, because Nancy Sinatra lives here now in Palm Springs. I mean,
uh-huh.
Frank Sinatra is famous for Palm Springs. He's very famous out here. He's done a lot of philanthropic work. And but the interesting thing was I did a deep dive into this song right when I was rereading the first chapter of your book last night, and I was like, wait a minute, this is so interesting. Bang, bang, she shot me down, you know, and the whole gunpowder thing. And then I like I said, I was doing a deep dive into the cell, excuse me. And it turns out Sonny Bono actually wrote the song for Cher. And Cher was the first one who sang it. And Sonny
Wow.
Bono used to be the mayor of Palm Springs. So I'm like, this it's like this whole song originated in Palm Springs for some reason. But it is very, very interesting. Um, because you talk about the whole gunpowder deafness and how gunpowder, was originated in China, where I also have tinnitus, where you got your tinnitus from, which is pretty interesting. So do you want to just jump into gunpowder deafness, which I think was very interesting, and fireworks? Because I know like fireworks are such a thing. You want to hear the pop. In Italy, where my mom is from, she's from Bari, Italy, a place called Caneto Mondrone, which they have this festival in November for this one saint. His name is Saint Trifone, and they have like this, it's all about fireworks for like a weekend, like nonstop, 24
Uh-huh.
hours for like 3 days. And even in the daytime, you can't see anything, but people love to hear the pop of the fireworks, and it's so crazy. And people will just go out to the fields and watch just smoke, you know, but they love to hear the boom. So let's talk about that.
Yeah, well, I mean, you imagine the world before, when there was the only humans were very primitive. For a long time, there were no really loud sounds in the world. Like thunder, uh, but nothing like what we're exposed to now. And two of the big changes were the Industrial Revolution, with these big, very loud machines, and the invention of gunpowder. And the one of the things I wrote about in the book is that people talk about the Civil War as this sort of watershed moment in military history. It was kind of the first modern war, and that casualties were what they were because people's understanding of warfare had not evolved to the same point that their ability to make incredibly destructive weapons had. And it's actually something that happens over and over again in human history.
Right.
Uh, the First World War was even worse on soldiers' hearing. Even now, it's amazing. This is a problem that uh, it should have been obvious a couple of hundred years ago, and yet there's really uh, still the number one and number two um, uh, health related claims by veterans to the Veterans Administration are tinnitus and hearing loss, and
Wow.
of
Yeah.
service related injuries. And because of everything you do, and even though there's awareness of hearing protection, I've talked to soldiers who said that during training, for example, using hearing protection was discouraged. It was sort of too soft.
Wow.
And yet if you're a soldier, you need to be able to hear what your commanding officer is yelling at you. And so there,
For
so
sure, right?
functioning ears have military value, but the military has not uh, has not really dealt with that. Still, uh, and there was a recent lawsuit that the manufacturer of hearing protection that was used until relatively recently it was a big class action lawsuit that it was hearing protection, but it didn't work very well. And there were soldiers who were deaf and despite it. But you see it everywhere. If you watch the NFL, if you watch football games, there are a couple of stadiums. My hometown stadium, Kansas Arrowhead Stadium in Kansas City, is one of the very worst. And in Seattle, where the fans are actually proud of pushing the crowd noise level, what's really past the damage threshold, well past the damage threshold, and you'll see a decibel reading given on the television screen. This is how loud the fans are, and they think of it, they're contributing to the game by making it hard for the other team to hear signals from the quarterback and things like that. But it's if you go to one of those games, if you have season tickets, that's probably one of the worst things you could be doing, is this repeated exposure to sound levels that are well above the level at which sustained exposure causes permanent permanent hearing loss. You will sometimes see now when football players' families in the stadium, their little kids will be wearing
Right,
ear
right, I've
protection,
seen that.
or you see it at rock concerts. The children of rock musicians. I remember the one of the first children at a rock concert that I saw wearing hearing protection was Kurt Cobain's daughter, uh, there with her mother, and she was wearing hearing protection. But really, people grown-ups who go to those concerts should have be wearing pretty significant hearing protection too.
For sure.
Almost any hunter will have suffered some hearing loss. Hunters tend to view wearing hearing protection as counterproductive. I can't hear a deer walking through dry leaves if I'm wearing hearing protection. But of course, if you deafen yourself, you can't hear those things either. And they're very you can like in the Cabela's catalog, there are some good electronic hearing devices that allow you to hear better when you're not firing, but at the within a tiny fraction of a second of firing, they shut down. So you sort of have it both ways. It protects your ears from the loud of from the damaging sound of the gunfire, but makes it possible to hear other things. So every hunter should wear those at least, and ideally they should wear stuff in their ears and then something over their ears, over the head, over the ear, hearing protection too, because it's very very loud.
Interesting. Also, like war veterans and PTSD from the loud bangs because they can be out in the world like after they've gone to war and they'll hear a car backfiring, you know,
Right.
and that'll trigger this PTSD response. I remember I was dating an FBI agent and he was undercover with the Italian mob in Naples. I've dated so many very interesting men. Um, and we were walking in North or West Hollywood one day, and he was infiltrating the Gomorrah mafia, and he was there for about almost 2 years, and they pulled him out, right? And so we were walking in West Hollywood, and a car just like backfires. He just flipped out. He was just like, and I was like, "Are you okay?" But he just was so traumatized. I mean, they
Yeah.
had put him at the airport, so, like, checking that's how he's like, "I got an airport job now," and he was upset because of his PTSD and everything he'd gone through, but it's very pronounced, so and also very interesting. But yeah, so I also wanna talk about, um there's so many great things to talk about. I don't know. I want to talk about listening and hearing and also conductive hearing loss and earwax. Of course, I haven't found, over the years, you'd think I would find very interesting things in ears. I think I found a raisin, a little bead. I have found Play-Doh. I mostly deal in pediatrics. Those are the
Right.
things. Earwax I find is very, very interesting. And you write about it in your book. It is like this sticky substance consists of secretions from the glands that line the external ear canal, plus dead skin cells, odds and ends. It protects the eardrum from trapping and gradually jetsoning. I love that. Jets your word.
Jetsoning. Yep.
Jetsoning insects, dirt and miscellaneous small intrusions, and also by acting as a mild antimicrobial. People get really weirded out by wax. They think it's like a nuisance, like feces, and it's
Right.
not,
It's
and I
not even
tell them,
wax. Right. Yeah.
I
It's
know
not
it's
even
not
wax.
even
Right.
real wax. It's like a combination of all these very interesting things that our body secretes. And because a lot of times when I get parents are like, that earwax is so annoying. And why does it happen? Because they're thinking it's feces. Like even the other day I was watching this TikTok where a nurse was like, "Oh, you could put Colace in the ears and get all the earwax out." And so I interjected and I was like, "Don't tell people to do." I go, "First of all, you need a doctor's order, and I guess they do this in the ER to get it fast, But I go, in all of my time as a nurse, I've never had to use Colace. I use hydrogen peroxide. water and it comes out fine. I mean, sure, maybe there are those weird cases, and maybe in the ER, or I think it's always like an ER doctor that's trying to be a cowboy, and will do that. But I was just like, don't tell people to do this. I think you think it's cool because it's feces. But I think this brings us to a good discussion here about earwax, what it really is. Because I mean, parents get so grossed out, or they get very interested. Like when I pull out a bunch of earwax, they'll be like, "Ooh, this is so cool." I had a woman that was putting it through her kid's earwax or her fingers and putting and just, touching it because of the consistency. And she couldn't stop touching it. It was very fascinating, but
I think, the earwax is how ears clean themselves. So most of the problems that people get into with earwax are caused by their efforts to deal with earwax. So you pack it in by, do the thing you're not supposed to do with a
with the
Q-tip, and you kind of
Q-tips.
pack it in, or you do one of these real horrifying things the where you stick something in your ear and then set it on fire and supposedly will draw out the earwax and all these things.
Oh, that's right. Yes,
Uh, there are lots of
I
candling of
forget what that's
earwax or
yes,
whatever it's called.
candling. Yes, yes.
But all those things are crazy. Now there are people who have sometimes they secrete a lot of it, or they have an oddly shaped ear canal, and it can, if it accumulates, or if they've jammed it in themselves, it blocks sound from getting to the eardrum, and so then it can be removed. But most of us would be much better off if we just forgot about it, and it takes care of
Exactly.
itself. It works its way out. It's water soluble. It dries and flakes away, and it's not a big deal. Um, but there are, one person I wrote about who was somebody who, like the person you were talking about, who had repeated ear infections, and it was a child who had many, 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 many ear infections, and so many that it had actually damaged her eardrum, and so sound wasn't getting through to the inner ear. She had really severe conductive hearing loss, and as often happens, know you've sure you've seen this in your practice, where it goes undetected, where doctors aren't looking for hearing problems, and or they check when a baby, newborns are usually checked for hearing loss, or little simple tests.
Right, they do the
Uh,
bear exam when they're bored, yeah,
right,
mhm.
and then often not again, and it can have. And New York City stopped requiring mandatory hearing tests at various stages throughout education, because they said, well, after birth, they're tested at birth, and after that point, it's usually caused by just something like accumulations of earwax. But even so, whatever the reason is that a child can't hear what's going on in class, something should be done about it. And very
Exactly,
often there are kids who have hearing problems that are undiagnosed, and then the assumption is that there's some kind of mental impairment,
psychological, right,
right? And they end up in special ed, and they must be autistic, they must have this, they must have that, and all it was is, or the source of all those problems was an undiagnosed hearing loss. And so the I think if the I would think that a medical professional, pediatric medical professional, anytime there's concerns about like delayed milestones or anything like that, the first the easy check, is to see how's this child's hearing. Is the child hearing the world? Because it's you can cause permanent damage if a child is not hearing things well during the period when, for example, they're acquiring language, which needs some kind of input, either through hearing or through sign language, or something, to take advantage of that window when the brain is especially receptive to language formation. I've watched it in my children and in my grandchildren. It's miraculous. You can't understand it, how these little people who aren't very old at all suddenly are doing this incredibly complicated thing of communicating, and having acquiring language, and when children miss that opportunity because they can't hear, or because their hearing problem hasn't been diagnosed and they haven't been given a way to compensate for it. It's tragic, because after a certain point, the brain is not as receptive uh, to those inputs as it is when they're very young.
That's an excellent point that you bring up, and I think that, like, when I first started practicing as a nurse practitioner in 2005, we used to do a hearing exam all the time on the kids, and that was part of our physical exam. Many places got rid of it because I don't think that, it's mandatory anymore, but what have we seen an uptick in? We've seen more of an uptick in kids with mental health problems, psychological problems, ADHD, but you think, could it really be hearing? And because we've now gotten rid of this, and all of a sudden we're seeing an uptick in ADHD and all these other issues, which, like I said, your book has been so enlightening to me where I'm like, you know what? I'm going to push to get hearing exams. Like I had a patient where he was having all these behavioral issues, and I started to really look at him and the way he speaks, because I would be quite a bit of a distance from him and I'd tell him something and he'd be like, what? And
Right.
then I told his mom, I was like, I think I need to send him for a hearing exam. It could be it. And I had just read your book, and she's like, no, 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 he just doesn't listen. He has selective hearing. I go, no, I would still kind of take him because I think there's something going on. And I have the privilege of seeing this kid almost like on a daily basis because his mom works at one of the clinics, and I'm just like, I'm watching him and I'm watching him more, and I go, and I kind of told her again, I think we should send him, to get a hearing test and stuff. But she's like, no, he just doesn't listen.
Yeah, I think yeah, it's too bad because you saw all the symptoms right there. It's clear that his problem was not a listening problem. It was a hearing problem. I mean, he wasn't
Right.
not paying attention to you. He was trying to pay attention to you, and he couldn't hear what you were saying. I do have friends who have, I have one guy I play golf with. Several. We're all late 60s, early 70s, and there are a number of hearing problems in that group. And there's one who people often say they think he has hearing problems. I said no, what he really has, he's really hard of listening, and he doesn't listen. But sometimes it's both. There's people who don't hear and also don't listen, or they didn't listen, or each problem makes the other worse. Uh, the but you certainly notice that people are more attuned to noticing it when they're older, but the time when it really makes sense to pay attention to it is when kids are really young. And I think the things that you notice, the speech difficulty, the inability to hear what you were saying, those are clear signs that something's not getting through.
Right,
And
for sure.
and
But
it makes
providers nowadays, sorry to cut you off, but
Yep.
providers nowadays only have 10 to 15 minutes with
Right.
kids, and
No,
sometimes,
and
it's so hard. Like back in the day, I used to see about 30 to 60 kids a day. But we would still get this hearing exam. We had the little machine, the medical assistant would put them
Right,
on the machine. If they failed, they would go just to see the audiologist, And I remember sending lots of kids to see the audiologist.
good.
But nowadays, if you're not testing for it, and then you're just throwing these kids through, and you only have a certain amount of time to see these kids, and sometimes you don't see them again for another year. They're
Right,
getting lost, unfortunately, and probably placed in places where they don't need to be placed, in
right.
school.
No, or they just have trouble, they just don't do as well in school as they would uh, if somebody had recognized the problem. And it's, you've seen it in your practice, I'm sure, how many kids get ear infections all the time. And if they get them,
Right.
truly get them all the time, it can cause hearing loss. And even um, uh, when it resolves itself, still during that period when they can't hear, they're not going to do as well in school as they would otherwise. So, and I think it's
For
probably
sure.
also, you see in your practice, you see kids, they come in because they have a problem, and if it's they have a bad cold, or they have ear infection, they're going to have trouble hearing, and it won't necessarily you don't necessarily know that when that ear infection or cold goes away, they're still going to have trouble hearing. uh, it's too bad. And school systems have they're always trying to cut back on the money they spend. And an easy way to do that is just to test hearing less. When in fact,
Right.
since it's one of the, you know, because it has such profound impact on kids' ability to function in school, it's the kind of thing that should be tested all the time.
I totally agree with you. I mean, one of the things that you brought up about your golf friend and I love how you wrote a lot about golf because hearing is so finite, like, when you're playing sports. I just went to the Paribas Open here in Indian Wells, and it's the first days when they're just having the practice sessions, and it's like, just hearing the ball volley back and forth and that pop, is just so interesting and satisfying. Like, as an athlete, you need to listen to all these little things, like, even the swishing of the golf club next to the ball, which happens after, right? It's not
Right.
happening while you're swinging, but it comes, like, later, in that little pop that you hear of the golf club hitting the ball. And if your hearing is poor, I mean, that's gonna be less it's like, how good of an athlete are you really gonna be if you can't pay attention to those fine tunes, right? Do you
No,
wanna talk
it's
a little
it's
bit about that?
yeah, it was a Golf Digest they did an experiment. It wasn't, it wasn't a double blind, peer-reviewed scientific experiment, but what they found was that hearing is incredibly important to golf, and you wouldn't think it for the reason you say. All the sound, what you hear, takes place after you've hit the ball. So how could it possibly affect? But they found that people hit the ball when they couldn't hear. They didn't hit the ball as well as they did when they could, and also that their long putting was worse when they couldn't hear.
Hmm,
And Arnold Palmer, who had began losing his hearing fairly early in his life, said that he couldn't play golf if he didn't have his hearing aids on. And
wow.
so, and there was a hockey coach who read the Golf Digest article and conducted a similar unscientific, unpeer-reviewed, but still very interesting study with hockey players, and found the same thing, that if you block the ears of hockey players, they had a much harder time hitting the puck. So this it's I think we underappreciate the complexity of our senses and how they work together, and in many ways. And I think there's sort of scientifically there's more appreciation now than there once was. But hearing and seeing are connected in the brain, and they work together in very surprising ways. And it's tennis too. If you look, you don't. Uh, it's very hard to be deaf and to perform at a high level in tennis, golf, hockey, any of those things. There have been uh, deaf tennis players who've learned to compensate by picking up information visually that players typically unconsciously pick up through their ears, and they can compensate. But still, there's not in the very top ranks in the world. There are no deaf players. It's a challenge. It's not it makes those difficult physical activities much more difficult, and in order to make up for the loss of the information that a hearing person gains through hearing, they have to devise other ways of doing the same thing. So there have been, a good tennis player will see things in the flight of a ball, in the spin of a ball, that a hearing player won't even know exist, because the hearing player can hear things that the deaf player cannot. But it makes you appreciate uh, the contribution that hearing plays to activities that you wouldn't think it had anything to do with, including just walking. You
For
get a lot of
sure.
information. You get a lot of information feedback on walking just from what it sounds like. And if you can't hear, it becomes much more difficult to just put one foot in front of the other and not trip, and keep from falling on your face.
And nowadays, everybody has, like, earbuds in. I mean,
Right.
I
Right.
know I know when I get patients in, they're here for a physical exam, and they have their earbuds in. I was like, "Hello?" I'm like, I don't even know sometimes they have long hair, and I go to check their ears, and they have earbuds in. I was like, "How do you expect me to check your ears?" But can you imagine if somebody has their earbuds in all the time? Another thing I wanna bring up too is maybe the reason why, because 'cause I'm having a problem lately with people hearing me, or listening to what I'm saying, and I think that's one of the most frustrating things for me is when I'm not heard. And one of the things that I started to kinda think about this morning is, well, nobody really talks on the phone anymore either,
True.
right? It's most of our communication is through text message. So it's almost like people are forgetting to hear or forgetting to listen, or just, I don't know. I've kind of have had this problem in dating, and I was kind of thinking about it. Is that why people ghost? Because they're not really listening to people. Like there's so much going on in a person's voice. There's like tonation, there's you could sense someone's mood very differently. I'm very clairaudient. I can hear just frequencies in people's voice and tone. Like I know when someone's lying by just their tone. Like it just there's something in me. I'm listening and there's something that happens. I can't even quite explain it. But then it just I get so like anger like I'm like something in me just like shifts and I'm like I know you're lying, you know. And I've talked about this with a few people, and Dr. Ran Anbar, he's a pulmonologist, pediatrician that was on my show, and he's talks about hypnotherapy. I just had a session with him, and I was just like, I noticed this happening, and he's like, "Oh, you're just very psychic. You just are very. That's just your clairaudience, like kind of like your superpower in a way." But and I can really hear. I mean, I know in your book you pick up like the vibrations and stuff, which I'm very sensitive to vibrations. Um, working in pediatrics, there's a lot of noise sometimes. And I remember I had a townhome that was connected to another wall, and I just, people's music next door and TV just sent me crazy. I just drove me nuts, you know, just when I'm trying to relax, and all of a sudden you hear these crazy vibrations and stuff. Do you want to kind of talk about a little bit of the inner ear and the hearing and the whole invention of the hearing aid? Because I remember as a kid we used to see those cartoons with the guy putting that cone shaped thing or
Right.
next to his ear,
And ear trumpet. Yeah.
an ear trumpet. That's right. That's right. Those people actually used to use those. Those weren't just in cartoons, right?
Right. They work. No, and they work too. You can do it by cupping your ears too if you can't hear conversation that's going on the other side of the table. You can because it 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 makes it pot you get more of the sound into your ears. The the first hearing aids were really pretty crude and huge. They were gigantic, and when kids had them, you had headphones on, and you had to carry around a big device and a battery pack, and there was a special harness that you would do it, or it would be something that would sit on a table. Now they're miraculous. Uh, this incredibly powerful technology that runs on extremely low voltage, and fits inside your ear, and what's really a very hostile environment for electronics. It's warm and it's damp,
Got the
and
earwax.
it's right. It's all this. It's a tough place to put a piece of electronics, and every time a company like Apple or Bose or one of a company that's not one of the big hearing aid manufacturers, they decide this is a huge, these things sell for thousands. This is a huge market. Let's get into it. And then they discover that it's incredibly hard. It's incredibly hard to make a good functioning hearing aid. The a difficulty that people have with hearing aids is I have glasses. I got them in fifth grade. Uh, I couldn't believe the change. I had never realized that when you looked at a tree, you could see individual leaves, that it wasn't just a big, uh, you know, green mass. The detail that I could see, the blackboard that I could see at school, it was huge. I went from having poor vision to having perfect vision, which is what happens when you put on glasses. Hearing aids is different. People expect it to be the same, and it's not, because one reason is that if you lose the ability to hear certain frequencies because you've damaged that part of the inner ear, you can't get it back.
Right.
So if it's weakened, you can make sound at that frequency louder so that you have a better chance of hearing it. But it's not the same. You don't Putting in a hearing aid is not the same sort of transformative experience that putting on a pair of glasses is. You also the brain also has to get used to a new way of hearing when you put in hearing aids, and so people will some often you'll often hear, you call an older parent, they say, "Wait a minute, I have to go get my hearing aid."
Right.
Well, they should be wearing it all the time because it's as though they're starting to wear here every time they put it in, they're starting from zero again. And what they really need to do is be training their brain to interpret sound in this new way with the amplification that in the frequencies where they need it. And it's tough. My wife and I went out to dinner with just a couple of weeks ago with it was three couples uh, and uh, everybody's late 60s, early 70s. And one of the main topics of conversation was hearing. Only one of the people at the table had hearing aids. Like all restaurants now, it was incredibly loud because uh, the whole design aesthetic in restaurants now is hard surfaces. The kitchen is open so you can see it. So all the noise from the kitchen you can hear. Uh, and often there's music playing, and often there's music playing loud because uh, people who own restaurants have learned that if you make the music loud, people talk less, they drink more, and they leave sooner. So you turn the tables over faster. Uh, and there's also this sort of paradox that even people who hate loud restaurants are often suspicious of really quiet restaurants because, like, how could it be any good? It's as
That's
quiet as the grave
interesting.
in there. So
Yeah.
uh, but restaurants are tough, and and cocktail parties. When I was
Yeah.
interviewing friends, I said, "How's your hearing?" "Oh, good." "Oh, well, except at cocktail parties."
Yeah,
And
I have that
there's
problem at cocktail part just anywhere where there's just a lot of people, I'm always like, I have to
right,
be right up to that person, yeah.
and it's that's age related among other things, and younger people are able to sort of basically hear what they want to hear in that situation and block out everything else. The way their brains work at that point are they're much better suited to dealing with what's actually known in the hearing world as the cocktail party problem. And as we get older, we lose the ability to do that. In addition to very often losing our ability to hear the very frequencies at which conversation mostly takes place. And so uh, the the it's those parties are not easy. And one of the sort of most devastating impacts of hearing loss, and you read about this all the time, is cognitive decline that goes along with it, isolation, social isolation. And what happens is if you can't hear, you can't participate in conversations with other people, in social interactions with other people. So if you can't hear, people tend to withdraw from social interaction.
And they
And
die faster, right? You
right,
found
it's
that
yes,
too?
it correlates with all kinds of of mortality problems. So you want to stay on top of your hearing. I mean, I know somebody who has very severe hearing loss. People always assumed when they saw him in social gatherings that he was just a grumpy, mean person, but the real explanation was he couldn't hear what anybody was saying, and
Wow.
so he would just sort of look grumpy and sit off to the side and not respond to anything. Well, he couldn't. It was cacophony to him when he was in there, or quiet cacophony. He couldn't make sense of anything that anyone was saying. And I had this realization myself. There was an evening where my wife and I and several other couples we had an evening at it was a picnic at a lake. We're sitting at a picnic table. It was a beautiful, beautiful evening. And one of the kids always would I rather be deaf or blind? My friends and I used to talk about this, deaf or blind, and almost always would say, "Oh, deaf." I
Right.
couldn't stand to be blind. But I realized at that meal, if I were blind, I wouldn't be able to see all these beautiful things. I wouldn't be able to see the children playing in the lake or the sunset and all these things. But if I were deaf, I would have just been a lump on the end of the bench. I wouldn't have been talking to anybody. I wouldn't have had any idea what they were saying. And it would have been as though I wasn't there. So in terms of the impact on your life, and this is what Helen Keller always said, that of her two
Right.
afflictions, deafness and blindness, the deafness was by far the worst because it blocked her from interaction with other human beings.
That is so interesting. I mean, it's really true. It's like we so take our hearing for granted, and and it's like, you think about it, would I wanna be deaf or blind? And after reading your book, I would be like, I probably would choose blind. I mean, knock on wood,
Right. Reluctantly,
but
right, yeah, right.
but all of
Right.
the little nuances that you would not be able to hear, and all the finite, like, I was sitting having coffee outside this morning, and there's a lot of hummingbirds here where I live. It's a little bit rural where I live, and this hummingbird just came. They come right up to my face sometimes, and you can just hear the flap of their wings, and it's just so amazing, you
It's your
know.
red glasses. Your
Yeah,
red
I know,
glasses.
it's
You look
my
like a
red
flower.
glasses.
Yeah.
Well, I was reading 1984 at one point, and it's a red book with a bullseye on it, and they would just come right up to it. Like, every morning I would sit up there to read it, I would just get one in my face. Like, I would be like, "Dude," you know,
That's great.
like,
That's great.
watch it." But yeah, one of the things, that's really popular right now is ASMR. Do you know what that is? Like, they're making videos, so it's autonomous sensory meridian response. So these people will make these videos, and they're very popular, and it's either people tapping on stuff with their nails, it's whispering, and what it's supposed to do, it kind of starts like a tingling sensation in your head that goes back to your neck. Maybe it's kinda like it has the same response as a tuning fork would, I guess.
Mhm.
So it elicits this relaxation. I mean, I don't I it's not my thing. I think it kind of creeps me out when I see one of those videos, but I find it very interesting how people get so addicted to it, and it maybe because they're wanting to hear more, find like wanting to more pay attention to, like, hearing, because they don't hear, and because we're reading all the time, you know, with text messages and stuff like that. I mean, I don't know. I find that very, very interesting. So,
Yeah, I don't know. I don't know. I've heard about it, but I haven't done it.
yeah, it's
One
not
th
my
one
thing. I don't know. It annoys me. So it has
one thing
the
that's
go ahead, go
oh, I
ahead.
was gonna say something that's very interesting now, I have a friend who's a little older than I am. 40 years ago, he suddenly lost all hearing on one side. It's sudden one-sided hearing loss, and nobody really understands what causes it, and or what you can really do about it. But anyway, he became completely deaf on one side. And recently, within the past year, he had sudden one-sided hearing loss on the other side too. So now he's completely deaf. And the chance of that happening is minuscule. I mean, there's very little chance that losing one hearing on one side will happen to you, and the chance that um, you would having lost hearing on one side, you lose hearing on the other side too. It's so close to zero you couldn't almost even calculate it. But he's lucky that now. There was a time when he would have been in the same situation that Helen Keller was in, where he just no access to anything. But now you can,
Wow.
on his phone, he, he can, his phone will transcribe what I say to him, or when we play bridge online, he has a program that transcribes, so he can respond just as though, if you don't see him, that he's reading something, you would have no idea that he's not simply just taking part in a normal conversation.
Wow.
And so I think that technology is amazing. And COVID was a boost to that, because in COVID, when everybody was, suddenly communicating as by Zoom as we are now, and
Right, right.
it gave a boost uh, to software that people who could not hear could use to see, basically to see closed captioning when they were talking with other people, which you can do it. It makes it possible to have normal conversations with people that are much more difficult, that would have been impossible without that technology. I mean, you can even my wife's brother is married to a woman who speaks very little English. She speaks Russian, and the but with Google Translate, they can have almost in real time
Right. A good
conversations. They just
conversation.
pass
Right.
the phone around. It translates. You can see it, and so there's somebody, when I was working on my book, said, there's never been a better time in human history to lose your hearing, because there's so many people who are working on technology, on medical solutions, on genetic solutions for people who have genetic hearing loss. There are all kinds there's huge amounts of money that are going into it because the
Yeah,
market
there's even the
is huge.
cochlear implants. We used to do a lot of cochlear implants when I worked at Children's Hospital,
Yep.
a lot of microtia repair as well with the outer ear. That does affect the hearing of the inner ear as well,
Yeah,
I
yeah,
think,
yep,
for sure.
yep, yeah. No, there are many possibilities now in like with cochlear implants, which were I was described to me by one scientist as the most amazing, the most incredible prosthetic device ever in history, and they keep getting better. It's pretty crude, that it hugely reduces the amount of signal that goes into the brain, the amount of auditory signal that goes into the
Mhm.
brain, and yet the brain is able to, with practice, make an extraordinary amount of sense from this very limited input. And it's another, testament to the extraordinary power of the human brain. I think most people I know, if you haven't seen anything, read anything about it, or learned anything about it, or undergone it yourself, assume that if you give somebody a cochlear implant, it just clicks their hearing back on. It's not true. It's a different way of hearing. It's a much reduced signal, but people who have them, uh, they adapt in ways that almost defy belief, where they it can be hugely beneficial. Now, my friend who has double-sided hearing loss, he has a little bit of hearing still on one side. So the question for him is, if he has the cochlear implant, that will go away because you destroy what's there. You would mean uh, depending 100% on his implant, and never and giving up the hope that some of his hearing will come back, which is still remotely possible. But he's glad that that option is there because there's a chance that he could, uh, even with a two-sided cochlear implants on both sides, he could come very back to functioning in company in some ways better than he was able to when he had only one good ear. When he went out to dinner with people, he had to be sure that he sat on the correct side of whoever was sitting next to him. He had to explain, I
Right.
can't hear you. And he said the one good thing is if he could make all he had to do was turn his good ear to the pillow when he was lying down. The room was quiet, and I said, "Oh, it's total silence." He says, "Well, no, it's not exactly total silence because he has tinnitus in that ear and now on both
Right.
sides, which is common, and if not universal in people with when you lose hearing, it doesn't become a silent. Your brain
No,
tries
you
to
hear
fill in
that
fill in.
buzzing of the cicadas. I love how you put that. I mean,
Uh,
here we have cicada season, July up until about October, November, which is pretty crazy. I had a friend come down and he's never been to Palm Springs, and he was like, "What is that noise?"
yeah, right, right. No, if it were coming from your neighbor's house alarm, you would call the police. But I
Right.
love it. I love that sound. I grew up with that sound. But
Yeah.
interesting thing is that my my tinnitus, it's there all the time. It's a high pitch, but
Mine
I
is
don't even
too. Mine is there
I
all the
don't
time, but
I
it,
don't
it
notice it
me
more than
neither.
I seldom notice it. I'll go for days without noticing it at all. But when I did notice it was when I was working on the book. And all I'm thinking about was tinnitus, and so I heard it all the time. And I
I
talked to
noticed it more when I was reading your book.
right, of course, and I talked to a researcher who deals with veterans who have hearing problems, hearing loss, and tinnitus. And he said maybe that their approach, he would have tinnitus sufferers make a tinnitus diary. You write down every day when you couldn't hear. He said maybe that's just exactly the wrong approach, and it is because
Probably.
you're making these people. The only real cure for it so far uh, is to train yourself not to be bothered by it. And if you're telling someone that they have to pay attention to it around the clock, you're undermining your own efforts to help them learn to ignore it.
I agree. I totally agree. Well, this has been a super fun conversation. I love this episode. This is so interesting. I learned so much from your book and from the conversation as well. Is there anything you want to add, and where can people find you? And where
Oh,
can they find your book? On Amazon, I know.
yeah, right, on
On your
Amazon.
website, yeah.
Yeah. The website
I
is just
mean,
davidowen.net. And yeah, in the New Yorker. The I don't the thing that I would first of all I would say never take medical advice from a freelance writer. So don't do anything because I suggest it. And but the one thing I would say and I would feel comfortable saying is we should all be careful with our ears.
for
You can't get it
sure.
once you lose it, you can't get it back. And so I have I have uh, earplugs on my keychain, and I try to remember to protect my ears when I'm doing something loud. I certainly, when I'm using a lawnmower, when I'm using a chainsaw or doing
Yeah.
anything, uh, I try I try to do it, and it amazes me that my ears still work as well as they do. I've had a small amount of hearing loss, age appropriate hearing loss, but not enough to wear the hearing aids that I got when I was researching my book. I went to a hearing aid manufacturer and got the hearing aids, and I wore
Oh,
them
interesting.
for a few days. But the one difficulty, if your hearing isn't bad enough yet, uh, they made a kind of a swooshing sound that would modulate every time I made a sound. Like if I clicked a key on my typewriter. I talked to an audiologist about it. He said that's because the hearing aid, it raises the volume when there's something to listen to.
Kind of like
It's
calibrating
and so
in a way.
when you make a noise, it tunes up. But if you can still hear pretty well, you hear it going up and down. And it was so annoying to me that
Interesting.
I couldn't stand it, even for research. So I have them, like most people's hearing aids. They sit in a drawer, waiting until I get to the point where I feel that I really need them.
Mhm. Like I said, your book has been so even now talking about the blow the noise that you make with either a chainsaw or even the blowers, like here in California, everybody has those blowers. My mom
Oh,
is addicted to her blower, and she has poor hearing and stuff. She talks really loud. And now I'm thinking my neighbors. Again, it's that they don't hear me, but they talk really loud, and he's always got his blower. So I swear to God, the guy's probably got some hearing loss going on.
oh yeah,
Yeah, 'cause
undoubtedly.
yeah.
Those machines are terrible, and people when I was growing up, you walked around the neighborhood in the fall, you smelled burning leaves. Now you hear, really, the from the day the snow melts till the day the following winter when the snow falls again. There's some nearby blowing leaves, and it's so much a part of the background noise
Oh,
in
yeah.
suburbia now that you often don't even notice it. There was once I was with my friends on the golf course, and it sounded like a jet engine. It was like at a school, and they had some you know, super powered leaf blower. And then it finally stopped, and we were, silence.
Oh,
But
yeah.
then after like 20 seconds, we realized, oh, that's not silence. Now we can hear the other leaf blowers that were going, that one was drowning out. And it's amazing. They're everywhere.
Yeah,
Uh,
especially here, like when I lived in Los Angeles, like North Hollywood, Burbank, synonymous for leaf blowers, like all the
right.
time.
All the
It
time.
was so annoying as much that this guy made a t-shirt that said North Hollywood on it with a leaf blower guy. You
Right.
know,
Nobody rakes
that's
anymore.
what you know
Yeah.
North Hollywood for, and Burbank leaf blowers.
Right. No, it's crazy. It's like
It's
just the
so yeah, and
background
so much.
noise of
Yeah, go ahead, go ahead.
I was just say the background noise
Background.
of American society. It's pretty much, and
It's so
it hasn't
true.
always been true. It hasn't always been true. The
Yeah,
worst are
but
the gasoline powered ones, the two-stroke engines. But the
right,
electric
they
ones are bad
just,
too.
banned them in Los Angeles,
Right. California's
last
way
year.
ahead. Yeah, California's ahead of everybody
Yeah.
else, but there's still the electric ones are terrible too.
Yeah, the electric ones are because they go, they have this
Yeah.
weird up and down. I mean, oh, when I'm around my mom and I'm just like, "Oh, it's leaf blower time."
Yep.
Like every morning she has, and it's more of an addiction because I'm like, "There's no leaves. What are you
Yeah.
doing?"
Right. Right.
It's
Or
all
you see them
concrete.
blowing
Yeah,
one farther and
one
farther
leaf.
away.
Yeah.
It would be easier
Anyway,
to bend down and pick it up.
awesome. Well, thank you so much for being on the Nurses
Thank
and
you.
Hypochondriacs podcast, David.
Thank
Awesome.
you.
Thank you so
Okay.
much.
Bye bye.
Bye.